Okay, let's go ahead and get started so you have that full hour and people will join us as they come in. Welcome everybody to another CI Compass webinar. Today, we're delighted to have Amy Koerber with us today, who is a professor in communication studies and a senior associate dean for administrative and academic affairs at the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University. Today, she'll be speaking to us about leadership in STEM professions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kober.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here today. I have just a few thoughts I want to share with you, and then I'm hoping we have some time for Q&A at the end. So my talk today, as you know, is titled Leadership in STEM Professions, and I kind of gave it a subtitle that I think captures my particular approach to leadership, and hopefully some of what I talk about will be relevant to the work that you're all doing as part of this program. So my subtitle, like I said, is called Strategies to Achieve Disciplined Interdisciplinarity. And I want to start by providing, well, first of all, why does this matter? I don't think I need to tell any of you in this group, complex problems require that we work and think across disciplinary boundaries. And disciplined interdisciplinarity is a concept that it's a term I took from Ellen Barton, who is a communication scholar who has done a lot of work studying communication in clinical medical encounters. So I want to, rather than dwell on definitions, I want to kind of illustrate this concept with some examples. I want to start with a story here. So one of my areas of research over the years has been understanding the history of discourse or language that we use to talk about women as being hormonal kind of beings. And one of the most fascinating things I learned from this research a long time ago is a story that I think just beautifully illustrates the power of thinking across disciplinary boundaries and why it's so important. So I learned very early on in my research that the word hormone is actually pretty new in the history of science. And it is traced to 1905, and it comes from the Greek word for to set in motion. And so the story of that is in 1905, there was a physician named Ernest Henry Starling, and he was getting ready to give a big talk to the London Royal Society, which like back then, I mean, that was, that was the pinnacle of kind of scientific success. Well, the night before the lecture, he was still struggling on what to call these things. And there had been a lot of terminology floating about. They were using terms like chemical messenger or internal secretions to vaguely describe this thing in the body that they knew was responsible for various processes like respiration, digestion, reproduction. All these bodily processes were kind of coming into focus, but they lacked a unified term to talk about this thing. So the night before he was giving his talk in 1905, he had dinner with a friend of his who was a scholar from classics. And over dinner, the classics scholar suggested the word hormone. And I mean, it changed. A lot of my book is about the way that this fundamentally changed how we view the human body. And it started a whole new discipline. Within about 10 years after that, there was a whole new discipline of endocrinology. Now it's an entire medical specialty, and it fundamentally changed the way we understand the human body. And that never would have happened had there hadn't been that communication across those disciplinary boundaries. So I really love that story. Got a couple other examples. This is another one I really like because, again, a lot of my research has been in the context of medicine and healthcare. And so this is called the Yale Heart Attack Study. But basically, a lot of you probably know that within the last 10, 20 years, heart attack survival rates have dramatically increased in the US. And this is obviously a really good thing. But what is surprising about it, and why I think this is a great example, is because this particular study showed that the most important reason for these improvements has to do with improved communication. Only a small percentage of it has been medical advances, but because we're communicating better, because we have things like mobile technologies that allow the whole team to communicate simultaneously, because paramedics can perform an EKG and then send the results back to the ER. A lot of this stuff is simply has very little to do with medicine and has everything to do with communication. Another example that I'm just kind of starting to explore, but I'm really fascinated, is collaborations between theater and other fine arts and the STEM disciplines. And the specific focuses of many of these collaborations is to overcome this big problem that we have about misinformation or, decreasing trust in scientific authority. So using artistic means to collaborate and connect with audiences in a way that, logic and reason is just doesn't seem to be doing anymore. So another one, combinations between really serious collaborations between architecture experts and healthcare providers, healthcare experts, to understand how we can design buildings in ways that actually improve human health. I mean, going beyond things like color and actually thinking about, lighting and structure and the way you move through a building as things that have direct impact on human health and well-being. So those are just a few examples. And then kind of to summarize, I hope that kind of illustrated what I mean by disciplined interdisciplinarity and what we are going for. But I will summarize my leadership experience by saying this is not something that just happens because you put a lot of disciplines together. It requires effective leadership. And I used pottery as my image here because several years ago, I thought it would be fun. My husband and I thought it would be fun to take a pottery class and thought, oh, wouldn't that be just really cool? Like give us a nice stress reliever. Well, this was my perfect example of, people who know what they're doing. They make it look so easy. You just plop down the clay and you have a beautiful pot that emerges several hours later. And it is so much harder than that, which I would say is the same about disciplined interdisciplinarity. So just a little bit of background on me. I started out my career at Texas Tech as an assistant professor in the English department. My area in that department was technical communication and rhetoric, and that is kind of my background, tracing back to my dissertation, is studying, how experts communicate across disciplinary boundaries. So I was stayed as a faculty member through 2014, focused on my research. In 2014 was the first opportunity I had to move into a leadership position. And at that time, I was appointed as director of the technical communication rhetoric program in the English department. I did that for a few years and then had the opportunity to move over to the College of Media and Communication, where I am right now. And I started out for a couple of years as Associate Dean of Faculty Success. Then I was promoted, or at least job title changed, to Associate Dean for Administration and Finance in the same college. Then just last year, I was promoted to Senior Associate Dean. And then in June 1st of 2026, I'm excited to announce that I'm going to be leaving Texas Tech, although some sadness there, but very excited to begin an appointment as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Texas Women's University. So I'm hoping that's going to be kind of the next phase of putting to test some of my leadership principles that have to do with this disciplined interdisciplinarity. So, and then also, I also have sort of a research experience that I think has given me additional perspectives on interdisciplinary leadership. And the three pictures over here on the side kind of go in reverse order, unfortunately. But I started out, my dissertation at University of Minnesota was on breastfeeding discourse. So it's on kind of understanding the history of language we use to talk about breastfeeding, but also the language, the ways in which information is communicated to mothers. Then mid-career, I moved into the hormonal research project that I talked about. And that was my second book, Hysteria to Hormones. And then most recently, this was the product of an NSF grant that was collaborative and highly interdisciplinary. We had a 4-year grant to study from the NSF to study predatory publishing, and my co-authors and I, who represented like 5 different disciplines across the university, co-authored this open access book called The Predatory Paradox. So what a very important premise that I take away from all of this, the leadership and the research, is diverse knowledge is better knowledge. And I have yet to find someone who's going to convince me otherwise of that, other, external political pressures aside. And theoretical sort of principles that I think have kind of shaped this since the early days of my academic career is feminist standpoint theory. And then Sandra Harding is a feminist philosopher of science who has a concept of strong objectivity. And basically what she means by that is, she said our Western ideas of objectivity have always privileged one very narrow way of knowing the universe. And even though that's a very narrow perspective on the world, we treat it as the most objective. But she said, if we really want to achieve objectivity, we need to go for strong objectivity, meaning that we find perspectives or standpoints on the world that encompass multiple perspectives. And that's diversity in a lot of different senses, not just racial or gender diversity, but intellectual diversity and geographic diversity and all of that. So then in the next phase of my talk here, I want to kind of go into a little bit more detail on lessons I have learned about how to make this happen. So my first lesson is embracing paradox. And so Smith and Lewis are actually management scholars, and this is a paradox theory is something we came across while we were writing the Predatory Paradox book. But I think it's a really powerful way to understand leadership in diverse environments and interdisciplinary environments. So they define, Smith and Lewis define a paradox as contradictory yet interrelated elements that exist simultaneously and persist over time. And I think that really resonated with me because both in my scholarship and in my leadership experience, I've found that the only way you're going to be sort of happy or satisfied in these difficult pursuits is if you accept that things do not make sense and contradictions are inherent and something to be embraced rather than to be fought against. And just one little example from kind of my current thinking as a leader in in higher education today. So we've got lots of industry research kind of telling us how we might need to change and adapt to today's students. But one that I find especially interesting. So I had always told my own kids and, my students that I teach over the years is you just need to major in what you're passionate in, because most people, 10 years out, they're not doing, there used to be literature that supported this. Most people are not doing things that have anything to do with their major. So, and that, I think that bit of truth that I was telling them was true several years ago, as reflected in this slide here that shows a survey in 2013. Only 27% of college graduates were in jobs directly related to their major. Well, guess what? Once I started updating myself, I realized I need to change my advice, because a more recent survey in 2023 showed that a much greater percentage of college graduates were in jobs directly related to their major. And I will tell you anecdotally from my own children, as well as students that I interact with, students today or potential students are choosing majors that lead to a direct career path. So you want to major in finance or major in accounting because you're going to be a finance person or an accountant, and so on, which is very different from what was the case, 10 or 20 years ago. So that's one side of the paradox. Now, the other side of the paradox that I just find so interesting and possibly productive is that even while that shift is happening and students are gravitating more towards specialized degrees, we have this other thing going on that the half-life for specialized skills that students learn in college is rapidly declining. So in 1980, it's estimated that that half-life would have been about 10 years after graduation. So 10 years out, probably half of what you learned in college was still relevant. It is now anticipated, and this could even get, more dramatic with the rise of AI, is that by 2030, our half-life of specialized skills could be less than 2 years. So what does that mean? Even while students are choosing more specialized degrees, we really need to educate across disciplinary boundaries more than ever. Because if we jam our curriculum full of those specialized skills that only have a half-life of 2 years or less, they're going to get out of college and they're not going to have everything they need to survive. Okay, so that was my first principle. My second sort of principle I want to talk about is another feminist scholar I really like is Donna Haraway. And Haraway says that she uses the concept of passionate detachment, which in her words means only partial perspective promises objective vision. So, and that's a really hard thing to implement as a leader because, of course, you want to think, well, I'm in charge, I'm responsible for everything. My perspective must be the most important. But I've actually learned over the years that that is not the case. And the more that you can see your own perspective as partial and limited, the stronger you're going to be as a leader. So let's see, a couple of data points to support this. So the cost of ineffective listening, I mean, if you think of, the old leadership model or whatever, where, what the boss says is how it is. Well, if there's no listening going on between the leader and the people or among the people themselves, your company is going to lose money. So this survey here, 2021 survey showed that the average company of 100,000 employees, ineffective listening costs $62.4 million a year. So just think about that. And then something that is really kind of dear to my heart because of what I said about how I value, I think, diverse knowledge is so important and multiple standpoints is what makes things better, is this quote right here. Most leaders are natural talkers who thrive at casting vision. Sorry, I'm having to move my thing around. Motivating the troops and presenting important data in an informative way. But the type of leaders needed to foster inclusivity are next level listeners who know how to listen as well as they speak. So again, that's why I see listening and partial perspective as such an important leadership quality. Okay, so what does this look like in practice? So I've developed this little visual that I try to use on a daily basis. And I wish I could have just stopped, would have been neater if I could stop with the first two part because it would have just spelled lead, but I really felt like it wasn't effective without the last two parts. So what do? First you listen, then you empathize, then you assess, then you decide. And like I said, it would have been a lot cleaner if I could stop there. But I think these last two parts are very effective because at some point you do need to communicate and you do need to act. Otherwise, nothing's ever going to get done pretty much. So that's to me what this passionate detachment looks like in practice. So my leadership takeaway, just to kind of summarize here, is diversity makes an organization excellent and specific forms of leadership communication foster diversity. Okay, lesson number 3, seeing beauty in constraint. And again, I can't take credit for this idea, but there's a really great book I've read recently that I encourage everyone to read. It's called A Beautiful Constraint. The authors are Morgan and Barden, and it's really written in the context of kind of design and corporate culture and a lot of emphasis on technology and stuff, but I think it has great applications to science and the academic encounter. And a sort of shorthand version is they say we need to move from the idea of we can't because to we can if. So again, that's thinking around constraints, and a lot of their examples in their books are about how the great examples of things that have been designed because of constraints and workarounds that people had to come up with. So sort of a roundabout way to talk about this in the context of higher education. Again, some more industry literature is on the bottom half of the slide is something that we hear a lot about in higher education is there's simply fewer bodies to, like, we're going to have fewer students. There's this enrollment cliff. And then by the time of the end of the 2020s, overall college, the number of college-bound students in the US is going to decrease by 400,000. So that's something that's very concerning. It's what I would consider a constraint in the context of higher education. The top half of the slide is something else that's sort of not helping us. And this is media coverage that, and I'm not saying the media coverage is not true, but it's also sort of doubling down on this problem we're facing, is reporting things on, college degrees being less valuable or people being able increasingly to get jobs without college degrees. So I feel like we have sort of a double whammy of constraints here. And so what are we going to do? I'm really reading a lot about and learning a lot about alternative approaches to the bachelor's degree. And some of these are ideas were from a recent report by the Burning Glass Institute. And some of this we're already doing at Texas Tech, and you're seeing universities do elsewhere, is, we know even if students are less interested in college, we know that they still need the skills and the training. So what can we do to sort of meet them where they're at? And so they have some different ideas: expanding skills and career planning, making some dedicated internships, breaking the bachelor's degree into smaller usable credentials. So maybe someone can sort of fit it in around their workday, considering alternative formats. I'm very keeping my eye on, there's a handful of universities across the country that are experimenting with 3-year bachelor's degrees. And then some I'm hearing about that are experimenting with like an accelerated bachelor degree where you get most of your coursework done in 3 years. And then your 4th year is a paid internship, which that can be really appealing to today's college students. And then just continually reviewing our curriculum to make sure the labels we're using translate to the skills that industry needs from our students. And then here onto the sort of the beautiful side of the constraint is there is still some good data we can build on to make the case for why degrees are valuable. There's still a 25% premium in what they call a wage premium within 1 year of graduation, and that is across disciplines. There is a bachelor's degree is worth more than 4 years experience for a non-BA employee, again, in terms of that wage premium. And then this one I love here in terms of, getting back to our disciplined interdisciplinarity is the bachelor's degrees with the biggest wage premium are those that have a mix of foundational and specialized skills. So again, that speaks to educating across the disciplines and educating the whole person rather than just providing specialized skills. Okay, so my leadership takeaway here, I kind of stole this from one of my colleagues who's just recently made some branding material that said comfort zones are overrated. And then I just added on, they're hard to come by anyway. So it is not a time to sort of rest on the way we've been doing things forever, because we do face some new constraints. And I'm confident that we can find beauty in those constraints if we just keep trying. Okay, then my 4th takeaway here is about impact, reconsidering impact, which I'm sure, in the scientific community and really in the academy as a whole, impact seems to be everything. Everybody wants to have more impact. Well, what does that mean? A lot of times in the academy, it gets boiled down to how many citations do you get, which is very important, and I don't want to underestimate that. But I think there's so much more we can be doing as academics and scientists and other scholars across the disciplines in line with this San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which is usually referred to as DORA, which came about in, I think, 2012. And it was a whole bunch of people from across the country came together and wrote this resolution that we need to, quote, consider qualitative indicators of research impact, such as influence on policy and practice. So I just think there's a lot that can be done there. And again, I have a few examples, and this relates back to something I kind of alluded to earlier in my presentation, but kind of the declining public trust in science and expertise of all kinds. And I think communication is so central to this, rebuilding this relationship, because it is through communication that we can sort of discover where that breakdown is and then hopefully find ways to overcome it. And I have some just interesting statistics here. I mean, when we say trust is declining in science, that's really only a small part of the picture. We live in a moment where trust in general is declining. And this statistic absolutely astounded me when I came across it. 1 in 5 Americans have few people that they can trust, have only 0 to 1 people that they trust in this big survey. And this is on a downward trend over the last few decades. And this is just talking about life in general, not having to do with science or anything. But I think it's a powerful indicator of kind of where we're at as a society. And perhaps not surprisingly, is when you look at the numbers in this chart here, is the decline in trust is even more serious for certain underrepresented populations. And so then this is this Edelman Trust Barometer, which is, again, I think a finding that's very relevant to the work that we do as scientists and academics. Respondents trust their own peers as much as they trust scientists for information on new innovations. So think about that for a minute. Again, what does your degree and expertise really mean if people would just as soon go and get information from their peers as looking to scientific experts? And then again, emphasizing the importance of communication, 42% of US respondents believe that scientists do not know how to communicate with people like me. And so what can we do about this? I like to say that with information circulating more widely and quickly than ever before, scholars across the disciplines are realizing that effective delivery of scientific knowledge to diverse audiences cannot be separated from production of that knowledge. And I probably don't need to tell a lot of you this, but if you think about it, you know, like even I've my career is advanced enough that, you know, back in the day when I was learning what it means to do effective science communication or technical communication, we were really working on a model where the experts do all this work to communicate the information, and then maybe they put out a press release and it gets picked up in the media. Well, that's just not the way it works anymore, because you have preprints, you have social media, you have people sharing stuff that may or may not have anything to do with science, but it sounds scientific. So it's just gotten a lot more confusing and faster moving. So anyway, some examples of my own research and how I think about this bigger problem of kind of impacting society or getting our knowledge out there and making sure that in addition to getting citations, we're also making the world better. And I put the image on this slide is one that I came across during my research on the hormonal woman. And these are some benches that are still there. So these are at a hospital. It's called the La Salpêtrière Hospital, and it's in Paris. And it started in the 17th century. And by the 18th and 19th century, it was like the place to go for research on hysteria, which was something I ended up researching quite a bit in my book, because I argue that hysteria, or the hysterical woman, was like the precursor to the hormonal woman. But anyway, I took this picture of these benches because it reminds me. So these benches were used, you can see the little door there. And the little door would be the rooms where the women were staying in individual rooms by themselves to be treated for hysteria. Okay. But they had some scientific research that showed that, getting exposure to a little bit of fresh air every day would improve their condition. So they created these benches, and literally they would set the woman on the bench, but she would be chained to the bench so that she could get her prescribed dose of whatever it was, 60 minutes of fresh air every day, without being able to leave the confines of the hospital. And I put that there as my reminder that no matter what we're doing, when we're thinking about impact and the benefits and the societal impact of our work, is we can never forget the impact we have on actual people. And just because you're doing good scientific research does not mean you're having a positive impact. So I just put here some examples from my research that, empowering women, empowering scholars in the global South and across the planet, really, in my third book. And then my current project, which is really about restoring trust and expertise. So, again, just thinking more globally about impact of what we do. And then here's an example from my current research, kind of pulling together a lot of this stuff that I've said about declining trust in experts and all of this. It was about, I think it was about a year ago now, when the Lubbock area was in the midst of a measles outbreak. And this one story that I read quite a bit about it, but among all the different competing, discourses that were out there, the one that really resonated with a lot of our local population was when Robert F. Kennedy made a reference to vitamin A as a way to fight measles. Well, so if you need to be convinced of what I said a few slides ago, where people are just as likely to listen to their peers as they are to scientists, this was great evidence, because there's this news story that said after he said that, just one comment that got circulated on social media and traditional media, local pharmacists could not keep vitamin A and cod liver oil on the shelves, so it didn't matter that it wasn't coming from peer-reviewed study published in one of the journals that we trust as academics. That was what people trusted, and that was what resonated with people. And I quoted some scholars here, these information science scholars, that talk about trust and techno-cognition. So they really say that when we're thinking about misinformation, we need to think of the whole techno-cognition, not just like facts versus things that we don't consider facts, but think about this whole techno-cognition that is the information ecosystem that we're living in. Okay, so my leadership takeaway here is just simply that we should never forget the larger purpose of knowledge production, and that we do need to think beyond just connecting with other academics and really think about how can we restore this relationship between the public and the academy. Okay, I guess I got through that a little bit faster than planned, but I would be very glad to take questions and discussion.